All right, welcome back to Introduction to Ethics. In today's lecture, we are going to be talking about virtue ethics, and one of the most important writers within virtue ethics is Aristotle. And so we're going to be talking some about his contributions to this idea of virtue ethics. Others have also contributed to it, but he's the one who is going to be the most important figure for us. Okay, so within these other systems, there have been different kinds of questions that we've asked and tried to answer. For virtue ethics, the ultimate question is going to be, what sort of person should I be? What sort of person should I be? Now, an answer to that question provides some of the most vital information that you can ever have, and yet none of the other ethical theories that we have examined so far have tried to address this particular question. The other ethical questions weren't worried about what type of person you should be. They were worried about things like maximizing happiness, or treating others with respect, or adhering to rules, and to other things as well. And so as we're trying to as we have looked at those other systems, they have been trying to set up morality based on these different concepts, but none of them have focused on the question, what sort of person should I be? What about the inside of me? Not just the actions on the outside of me, but what kind of person do I want to be on the inside? And virtue ethics is going to focus on that particular issue. So to see what's missing in the difference between all of these other issues, all of these other moral theories, and what virtue ethics is actually trying to do. Think of it this way. Imagine that you've got a police officer who obeys the law, but only reluctantly. And they always do what is minimally required of them. They do the minimum that they have to, the minimum that they can. And if he could get away with it, that police officer would extort money from businesses. He would brutalize prisoners. He would doctor evidence. He doesn't actually do any of those things because he thinks he might get caught, but he would if he could. Is that a moral police officer? Is that a person that you would look at and say that they're a virtuous person? Well, the answer seems to be pretty clearly no. And what's missing is what is happening on the inside of the ethical picture. It hasn't anything to do with what they're doing on the outside. They're not doing anything illegal, but that's not the kind of police officer that we want in place. We want police officers in place who do the right things and for the right reasons. But again, with those other moral theories, they weren't concerned about what was happening on the inside as far as utilitarianism or deontology or those other things were concerned. What that police officer then is doing on the outside would be okay, but virtue ethics is going to look on the inside, and it's going to focus on more than just the actions of that individual. All of the moral theories we've reviewed thus far share a common assumption that the moral philosopher's primary task is to define the nature of our moral duty. On this view, what should I do is the crucial moral question. It's what should I do? What action should I or should I not take? But that's not where virtue ethics is going to be focused. Once we have an answer to that, I can know what sort of persons I should be, namely the sort of person who does their duty and is reliable within it. But what if the approach is different? What if we take the approach here that virtue ethics is going to take? What if we begin by considering what makes a desirable human life, examining the conditions and the character traits needed to flourish, rather than begin with a theory of moral duty? What if we begin with a picture of the good life and a good person, and then we try to figure out what virtue and what ethics is and should be from that perspective? So instead of the perspective of what should I do, we're coming at it from the perspective of what kind of person should I be, right? Virtue ethics is not a single theory, but rather a family of theories that can trace its history to the philosophy of the ancient Greeks Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, written about 2,400 years ago, remains the primary source for virtue ethics today, and we're going to look at some of its major themes as well. So one of the major themes: an act is morally right just because it is one a virtuous person acting in character would do in that situation. Okay, now we're thinking about this kind of mentality, right? We're thinking about this. What is morally right and wrong is what a virtuous person would do as long as they're acting in character. Aristotle realizes that even a virtuous person could potentially behave outside of character, and then what they were doing would be wrong. So as long as they're a virtuous person and they're acting within that character, then if that's what they would do in that situation, then it's morally right. According to virtue ethicists, actions aren't right because of their results or because they follow some hard and fast rule. Think about the other moral theories that we've examined. They follow hard and fast rules. Rather, things are right because they would be done by someone of true virtue. This person would be a role model or an example. It would be somebody that we would look up to and we would try to emulate. We would want to be like them. They would provide a goal for the rest of us to shoot for, even though each of us will fall short of that goal at some point. So what we would do is we would say, how would this person behave? We put them up as the example, and the rest of us try to live up to the example that they give to us. Sometimes rules are necessary, and sometimes a role model is not sufficient. Now, one of the good things about virtue ethics is that it is very, very flexible, and it can kind of maneuver around in a lot of different ways. And so if you're saying, well, we should follow this role model, we should follow their example. If there isn't a role model, or if that's not sufficient, what if we need something more than that? That's okay, because virtue ethics can give us rules as well. So we can use both role models and we can use rules. So virtue ethics can supply rules as well. It can supply rules like do what is honest, act loyally, display courage, deal justly with others, show wisdom, be temperate, avoid gluttony, reform from infidelity, don't be timid, lazy, stingy, careless, free yourself of prejudice, and so on. It can give us those kinds of rules, and so we don't necessarily just have to rely on a role model. We can have both. When the rules conflict, what do we do? Because remember last time we were talking in utilitarianism, one of the weaknesses of utilitarianism is what do they do with conflicting rules? Well, within virtue ethics, if we have conflicting rules, what do? We follow the lead of a virtuous person. And so what we've got here is rules and role models working in tandem. They're working hand in hand to try to give to us some type of guidance when it comes to the decisions that we should make concerning morality. True, there will inevitably be disagreement about who counts as virtuous, but that shouldn't cripple us. Now, I could name names. I could begin to call out different names of people that I consider to be virtuous people, and other people might look at the list of my names and say, no, those people aren't virtuous. But that shouldn't stop us. It shouldn't slow us down. There's lots of reason. There's lots of room for critical discussion about who is virtuous and why. Perfectly acceptable within virtue ethics. We can go out and have that discussion and say these people are virtuous, or perhaps they display this particular type of virtue, even if they don't have a different type of virtue. Maybe this is one attribute that they have that is virtuous, or even in one circumstance where they behave and in which they were a virtuous person. So we can have those types of discussions. There's lots of room for critical discussion about who's virtuous and why. In the end, we may have to agree to disagree, since there may be no way to convince someone whose moral outlook is fundamentally opposed to our own. So you can even have that within virtue ethics. You can have different people idealizing different individuals and saying that this is the virtuous way to go. This is the virtuous thing to do. Many previous theories have looked for some kind of hard and fast rule to be applied. Virtue ethics rejects the idea of a simple rule that lays out a method of behavior. And I think this is one of the great strengths of virtue ethics as well, is that it's not necessarily trying to make morality simple, because I don't think it can necessarily be. I think some instances can be simple. It's simple to say these things in these circumstances might be wrong, but I don't think the entire discussion, the whole of morality, is something that is easy and simplistic. Whereas, say, utilitarianism was trying to just say the greatest good for the greatest number, and that's a very simple approach to it, and there's some benefit to that. That's useful, but perhaps that's oversimplified. And virtue ethics has the ability to look at it and say it's much more complicated than that. Humanity is more complicated than that, and life in general is more complicated than that. And so I think that's a very powerful and important aspect of virtue ethics. Aristotle cautions that we must not expect the same degree of precision in all areas of study, and implies that morality lacks rules and methods of thinking that are as precise as, say, in a study like mathematics. And so in math, you have precision. You can be exact, just say, for example, in geometry. You can be very, very exact in that particular study. But Aristotle says, when it comes to morality, you can't expect that kind of exactness. You can't expect that kind of precision about what's right and what's wrong. And so you shouldn't expect it. For virtue ethicists, ethics are complex, a messy area of decision-making, one that requires emotional maturity and sound judgment. And so it's going to be complicated, and you have to have someone who is mature, and you have to have someone who has sound judgment as well. Virtue ethicists sometimes invite thinkers to imagine a rule book that contains all the rules and precisely how to and when to apply or when to ignore the rules. So imagine you've got this massive rule book where all scenarios are covered. Could you apply that kind of thing in a mechanical way without any need for judgment? Now, you could do that, for example, let's just say working on a car. You could do that. You could just say, here's the manual, and here's when you do this, and here's when you do that, and you don't do these things. Could you imagine a rule book like that that you would apply to every scenario in life, to every single decision that every single person has to make? The rule book would be massive, for one thing, but it also doesn't seem possible that you could outline every single scenario. And one of my favorite activities in class that I don't really get to do here online is to pitch to my students a scenario, a moral scenario, where, and I tell them at the beginning the rules. Some of the rules are you can't change the scenario, and I can, right? This first two rules. You can't change it, I can. And so we'll start with one scenario, and people will kind of line up on one side. This is the right way to behave. And then I'll change something pretty small, something seemingly really insignificant within the scenario, and then suddenly everyone will go to the other side. No, this is the way we should behave in this scenario. And then I'll change something a little bit, and then they'll go over here, and then I'll change a little bit, and then it goes over here. And so trying to account for every single change and every single circumstance that would happen within life would be almost impossible. To try to come up with a rule book that says, and here is when you can do this, and here is when you can't do this, right? It would be a very difficult thing to do. Does that really seem possible? It doesn't seem like you could really come up with that thing. Again, morality is not like geometry. It's not like civil engineering. It's much more complicated than that, and you have to kind of figure out the bits and pieces and what matters within each scenario and what doesn't. As virtue ethicists see things, moral understanding is not just a matter of knowing a bunch of moral facts. Now, you can know a bunch of moral facts about geometry and do just fine, but that doesn't seem to be the way it works with morality. If it were the way it worked, if you just had a bunch of moral facts and it was simple and you could just simply apply it the way you can, say, again, geometry, then you could have a child prodigy, and that child prodigy would be one of the wisest moralists, one of the wisest having the best understanding among us. And what we mean when we say something like a child prodigy is, think of someone like Beethoven, who was child prodigy with regard to music, to the piano. And so he could, at a very early age, play and compose. And so he was one of the great players and composers even when he was a child. Now imagine that morality was like that. If it was just a bunch of facts that you could memorize or know or understand, then someone like Beethoven, a very young child, could be one of the great moralists amongst us. And yet that doesn't seem to be the way it works. We have, child prodigies in mathematics or in music, but we don't seem to have child prodigies in morality. Now, there certainly are children who behave better than other children, but it hasn't anything really necessarily to do with the fact that they have a better understanding of moral theories. That's not what is causing most of these children either to behave or misbehave. So imagine turning to that child or that child prodigy who knows so much about morality for advice about dealing with things like difficult coworkers, or helping a drug-addicted friend through recovery, or even determining the best way to end or break off a relationship. Would you really turn to a child for advice on those things? Well, if morality was like mathematics and geometry and music, those type of things, then you could, because if you need to know something about mathematics, you could turn to a child prodigy, and they would be able to tell you. If they're a prodigy in math, they'd be able to tell you about that. But we don't see that in morality. Morality seems to be a different kind of creature, and so we have to approach it from a different angle. Moral understanding is a species of practical wisdom, not something that is just knowledge based. There seems to have to be something more to it than just the facts of whatever scenario it is. Think of some familiar kinds of practical wisdom, something like knowing how to inspire teammates to come together and bind together to accomplish some type of special project. Inspiring teammates is a practical kind of wisdom. It's something that you gain and learn and come to understand over time and through, in this case, obviously, practice. Such knowledge does require an understanding of certain facts, but it's much more than that. We all know people with plenty of book smarts and very little in the way of good sense. If you know that kind of world's smartest dumb person, right? They have a lot of book knowledge, but they don't seem to have just kind of the basic good sense that other people might have. Moral wisdom is a kind of know-how that requires a lot of training and, very important, a lot of experience. It doesn't require that you have a high IQ. It requires that you have experience and that you have training. We'll see how training comes in on this as well. And that you have that kind of maturity and wisdom. So moral ethics coming from that kind of angle, as opposed to coming to it from the rule-based angle that we've seen in so many of these other moral theories. We need experience, emotional maturity, and a great deal of reflection and training in order to acquire moral wisdom, say the virtue ethicists, right? So we need to have experience, emotional maturity, reflection, and training. We have to know how to read people, to be familiar with the sorts of troubles that people can fall into, and to understand the kinds of personality issues that can prevent us from flourishing, to have a keen ability to pick up on social cues. And we can't learn those things just from books. Now, books can help you learn those things, but there's more to reading people, reading and understanding society and what's happening within different relationships than just what happens in books. Books can give us some cues, but we need someone who can do those kinds of things in ways that have more to do with than just a textbook. For example, proper understandings of emotions and how they are useful in moral decision making can show us how wisdom and maturity are important. And so looking at the different emotions and understanding how they work and why they work the way that they do work, and which one we should apply and when, is an important part of virtue ethics and moral wisdom. And that's something that comes through maturity. That's something that comes through experience. Those individuals who have emotional and they are mature and they can understand, who understand emotions, are mature in their understanding of emotions. They understand that fear can signal danger, Guilt can reveal our moral faults, and compassion can tell us when someone needs our help. Um, and it's able to look at those and understand when they're negatives as well, when fear is a negative, when guilt can be a negative feeling as well. Sometimes guilt can hold us down or hold us back when it shouldn't. Sometimes it can propel us to be better people. And so that moral wise person is someone who can look at it and they understand emotions and they understand when that emotion is a good thing or when the emotion is a bad thing. It is no use knowing that you ought to help others if you never see their need. And so the mature person, the person who understands emotions, can see when other people are in need of help. If our emotions are trained, they can alert us to morally important features of our lives. If you know that person who seems to be able to look at you or to look at others and they can just tell something's wrong, right? And they see that something's wrong and then they ask and then they know how to help the person. Or hopefully you know that person. Maybe it's your grandmother, right, who's particularly sensitive to other people, and then once she realizes something's wrong, she asks them and then she's able to help them as well. That's experience, maturity, all of those things coming into play. Anxiety, let's see. Okay. Yeah. Moral wisdom is an extremely complicated, I think this is one of the most important words for virtue ethicists. Moral wisdom is an extremely complicated kind of skill. It is a skill. It's not something that you're necessarily just born with. Now, certainly you're going to have to be born with certain things, and then those things are going to be cultivated as you go through your life, but they are a skill. One of my goals, one of my dreams in life was to become an NBA basketball star. I didn't get anywhere near that. Why not? Because, I mean, I didn't have the makings. I didn't have the beginnings of that within within myself physically. Too short, don't have the right kind of touch on the ball and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I just don't have the beginnings of that skill set. But and so not all people are created equally in the sense of their ability to play basketball. Certainly some people have a different ability when it comes to being able to see moral situations and then being able to address the situation and figure out the right or best way to behave. On the other hand, morality here with a virtue ethicist is a skill in the sense of that, yes, you have to have some aspect, some beginnings that can be cultivated and developed, but there must be cultivation and development. It can't be that someone just walks out onto the basketball floor and suddenly is really, really good at basketball. There are skills that you have to practice and continue to hone as you go on into your career. The same is going to be true of morality. And so it's a skill. It's something you develop and practice over time, and so therefore it is going to take experience. It is going to take time to become developed. It does require knowledge of the way the world works, but it demands more than that. We must have a great deal of emotional intelligence as well. Moral virtues, the moral virtues which all require moral wisdom, therefore also require a combination of intellectual and emotional maturity. Right? So we have to be both intellectually mature, developed, takes time, takes practice, and we also have to be emotionally mature. Remember me telling you throughout the course, I think that humans are two things. I think we're logical, and I think we're emotional. And here, with Aristotle and his virtue ethics, he's looking at both of those things, and he's saying, we've got to have intellectual maturity. We've got to be logically mature, but we've also got to be emotionally mature. We have to have both of those things working together. A person with only a crude appreciation of life's complexities or a blank emotional life is bound to be morally blind. And so you have to have someone who understands that life is not simple. It is, in fact, very, very complicated. Otherwise, they're probably not going to be able to see moral questions and when it's right or wrong to do this or that morally. Virtue ethics perfectly explains why that is so. Something that they're going to be focused on. Again, virtue ethicists believe that moral understanding can be gained only through training, through practice, and through experience. It's a skill. It takes time. True, some people are by nature kinder, more generous than others, yet an impulse in that direction is not enough. Without wisdom, without that kind of practice, maturity, all those things, these traits will only occasionally lead to appropriate action. We shouldn't always give to others or tend to their needs. It might be the case that what they need instead is tough love, and a morally mature person can tell when a person needs tough love or when a person needs a hand up, something to help them out. And so those wise people, the morally wise people among us, can tell when a person should be helped and when a person should be told, no, you maybe you got yourself into this, you're getting yourself out of this. So we need that type of experience, those types of skills. The individuals who have insight, they're rational, they're emotional, they can balance and see the difference in when one's important or more important than the other. So virtue is not inborn. It's not something, according to the virtue ethicist, it's not something that we just walk out of the womb with. It's not something like that's part of our nature. Rather, it's something that it takes time to acquire. Not only does it take time to acquire, but it takes the right kind of environment and the right kind of teachers. Indeed, Aristotle thought that whether we are virtuous or not is partly a matter of moral luck, in the sense that you don't get to choose your parents. And so if you're raised by Nazis, you might have one type of moral outlook on life, and perhaps in that case, again, it might be very unfortunate that that's your particular moral outlook on life. You were unlucky in your particular role. And so for me, with my parents, I consider them to be quite moral people. They were very moral people, and they also were very good teachers of the moral perspective. They still are. They're both still alive. They still are very good teachers of the moral perspective and how we should behave and why we should behave in the way that we do. And so if we're lucky, we have wise, caring parents who will help us to develop. And if we're unfortunate, then we'll have those parents who don't help us to develop very early on. And so it's not something that we walk out of the womb with. It's something that we develop over time. It has to have the right kind of person on the receiving end. Hopefully I'm the right kind of person. I'm kind of signaling it myself. Hopefully I'm the right kind of person. And so if I am the right kind of person on the inside, and then my parents are good teachers, and then I have a good environment in which I'm raised, all those different things, then maybe I have a chance at being a virtuous person as opposed to the opposite of that scenario. So as a child matures, through experience and guidance, they eventually begin to subject the rules they have been taught to more and careful scrutiny. A successful education will produce an independent thinker, one who doesn't need the old, very overly simple rules as a crutch to get along anymore. Honesty might be the best policy, but at times it can be hurtful. So we teach our children to be honest, right? But as the children get older, they begin to understand that there are times when you don't have to be completely honest, or perhaps there are even times that you can be dishonest and it might still be okay, right? So the child, as they develop and learn, they begin to understand when they should or shouldn't be necessarily honest. As a rule, friends deserve our loyalty, but that doesn't mean, like we teach our children, be loyal to your friends, but that doesn't mean that you have to cover for your friend if they're stealing from the employer. All right, so the loyalty has its boundaries. You don't always have to be completely loyal to your friends. And so children might follow the rule, be loyal, but as you develop, you begin to learn through maturity and experience and training and all those other things, when perhaps it's a good thing not to be fully loyal. Okay, this line of thought supports the virtue ethicist rejection of a simple moral litmus test, a formula that could be used by anyone, no matter their degree of sophistication, right? This is where they're saying, look, it's more complicated than just follow a simple rule. Test every action by the same idea, right? If it produces good, then it's right, or follow, whatever your obligation is to your society. The virtue ethicist looks at that and says that's overly simple. It's too simple a test. Life's more complicated than that. Not only is life more complicated than that, as moral thinkers, we're more complicated than that. So such a test not only overlooks the great complexity of morality, but it also ignores the point that people possess moral wisdom in degrees. And so you can't expect that everyone understands morality in the same way and in the same depth. You can't even expect that people have the same degree of understanding. And so those oversimplistic rules aren't going to help everyone. The overly simplistic rules will help children because they're not an expert, they're a novice. But those overly simplistic rules are not going to help someone who is hopefully an adult and is more mature, and life gets more complicated as we go down the road. And so we don't look at those overly simplistic tests and accept them. Rather, we say life's more complicated, and we try to mature and grow and use bigger and better tests, although they're certainly going to become more complicated. The ultimate goal of immoral education is to make ourselves better people. And so when we look at these other moral theories that we've been talking about, the ultimate goal was to figure out how we should behave. But again, the ultimate goal for virtue ethics is making ourselves a better person, not just behaving in a moral way. How can I become a better person? How can I become someone who is courageous, just, temperate, and wise? I'm becoming a better person, not just behaving in a moral manner. A virtue is a character trait. It's not just a habit. So being a virtuous person isn't just the way you behave as you go through life. It's part of who you are. And so it's not just I do or don't do these things. This is who I am. This is who I am. Habits don't define a person. Character traits do. So I might behave justly, but am I a just person? Those are very different ideas. Behaving justly and being truly a just person, very different. And so it's not a habit, it's a character trait. Some people are habitually loyal or generous, yet they may lack virtue because they don't really understand why it's appropriate to act in this way. So virtue also has to have knowledge behind it. Remember, it's a skill, but it's also considered wisdom. And so a person might be generous, but do they understand why they're being generous? Only a virtuous person with that moral wisdom who understands it is truly virtuous, even if another person behaves in a generous fashion. That doesn't mean that they're virtuous. You have to have the knowledge of why being generous is the right behavior as well. While habits are defined as certain patterns of behavior, virtues require much more. In addition to routinely acting well, the virtuous person also has a distinctive set of perceptions, thoughts, and motives. So again, that virtuous person isn't just someone who does these things, but they understand the perceptions of why they're doing. They think about them as they're doing them, and their motives are thought about and are virtuous as well. The motive must also be thought through and virtuous. A generous person, for example, will have different thoughts than a stingy person. They will think about how to be helpful, will not think only of their own needs, but will value being of service and will believe in the goodness of caring for the less fortunate. So a generous person, it's not just giving. A generous person, that having that kind of virtue is not just enough to give. It's more than that. Aristotle says you have to have the right mindset as well. Their motives will be different as well. They're not begrudging of their time. They're moved to the distress of others, and they take pleasure in freely giving what they have to those in need. This kind of thinking can be applied to other virtues as well. It doesn't have to just be generosity. That's the example here, but all things, right? It's someone who understands that what they're doing, why they're doing it, and they've got the right motives, all of those things combined in there. Virtuous people are then defined not just by their deeds, but by their inner life. Remember, it's not a question of what do I do, it's a question of what kind of person am I. They see, believe, and feel things differently from vicious people. They see what's important, know what is right and why it is right, and want to do those things because they are right. They see, they know, they have that wisdom, they have that understanding, and on the inside, that's what they want to be. People are virtuous Only when their understanding and their emotions are well integrated, a virtuous person who understands the right thing to do will also be strongly motivated to do it without regret or reluctance, and they do it for all the right reasons. Internal, external, all those things have to be working together. So Aristotle thought it was obvious that all of us seek eudaimonia. Now, eudaimonia is the Greek word that is translated as happiness sometimes, but probably the better translation for that word is flourishing. So eudaimonia in Greek means flourishing, and think of it this way. Well, think of it in the sense of what's happiness. How often do we use that word? And when we use it, it's kind of that smiley face, have a nice day, happiness that fades so quickly. And that type of happiness does fade quickly. It either fades into the usual kind of the mundane, where you just are you happy in life? You're not necessarily happy. You're just kind of walking around doing what you have to get done for the day. Or maybe you're sad in life sometimes, or you're depressed, or whatever it might be, or the opposite of whatever happiness is if things are really stressful at home or at work or whatever it might be. And so happiness is something that seems to kind of come and go. It ebbs and flows and fades. Flourishing, on the other hand, is different. It's not something that ebbs and flows and comes and goes. When you're flourishing, you still can be in the midst of a struggle and still be flourishing. Think of it like a plant that reaches into the soil with its roots. In order to reach into the soil, it has to push its roots through that soil. And then once it's got its roots pushed into the soil, then it has to draw the water or the nutrients or whatever it needs. It's a struggle of sorts. But what happens is that as the plant is drawing the nutrients and the water that it needs through that struggle, it flourishes. It becomes stronger. It becomes a better plant, as opposed to the one who just lays over and never does anything and doesn't struggle. It's much like trying to remain physically fit. Through that struggle, through the difficulty that you face, whatever that type of physical activity might be, you come to have a better life because you struggle. And indeed, we see that humans who do struggle, who face difficulties, they come out on the other side. They're stronger for having gone through or fought, say, cancer, for example. They come out on the other side. They're a stronger, more flourishing individual. It's not happiness per se. It's someone who's struggling and becoming better and better through those struggles. I'm always reminded when I talk about eudaimonia, I'm always reminded of a plant that I saw in an arboretum in Fort Worth, Texas, where my friends and I were walking through this because we were working on our master's degree. We didn't have any money, so if it was free entertainment, we could try to go out and find those things that weren't going to cost us money. And so we were walking around the arboretum, and we saw this tree that had it's all covered, it's indoors, had a fan blowing on the tree. Was only like 3 feet tall. I mean, it was pretty short. It was a young kind of sapling thing, but it had a fan blowing on it. And so we're looking around at each other like, what in the why does this tree have just a little box fan there blowing on it? This is the silliest thing. So we started reading the plaque that was next to the tree, and what we found was that when this tree was brought up from South America, that's its native habitat, they planted it there in the arboretum, and it kept just falling over. It wouldn't stand up. It would just flop over. So they tried all kinds of things, like the diet and the water and all that, and they would stake it, like put a stake in the ground and tie it to the stake. It just wouldn't ever stand up on its own. And so finally, after they tried all of this, they figured out that maybe they should call people down in South America, where the tree is from. Yeah, maybe we should have started there, but they didn't. So it makes for a good story. So they called down to South America, where the tree is from, and the people down there, the tree experts down there, said that particular tree needs to have wind blowing on it in order for the bark to stiffen. And if it doesn't have wind blowing on it, the bark won't get stiff, and the tree will just constantly flop over. And so that's why they had the fan on it, was to imitate wind in nature And then as the wind is blowing on it, now the tree has something that it has to resist, and so it stiffens up and it gets harder and it becomes a solid tree. So just like in life, when we face those kinds of difficulties, we mature and we become stronger and we flourish because of the struggle. And that's what Aristotle's talking about here with life. We all look to flourish. Yes, we all want to be happy and we want enjoyment in life. We want those pleasures and the luxuries and all of those things. But he says what we're truly looking for is to grow and develop and become stronger, better individuals. And he said that's truly what we're after. Aristotle argued that virtue is an essential element in a good life. So if you're going to have a good life, you have to have a virtuous life. If you lead an unvirtuous life or a vicious life, one that is filled with vice, then you're not going to be happy. Aristotle said only those who are virtuous or are seeking to be virtuous are truly happy. That's not to say that enough calamity cannot somehow damage the virtuous. You may be a virtuous person, but if you lose all of your family and you've got horrible diseases and you can't walk and all, maybe you do nothing wrong, you're truly virtuous, but still you could have a life that is so disrupted by those types of things that are out of your control. Then maybe you won't have a happy life. But again, he says you must have that virtue, or it doesn't matter if you have health and wealth and family and all of these other things. You can't be happy, he says, without virtue. But what about all those criminals? What about all those mob bosses and I'm trying to think of the word that I'm looking for here. Mob bosses, crime lords. What about all these people who, that's what they do, warlords, and they bring all this evil and suffering into the world, and they have all of the money and all of the earthly pleasure that any of us could want. What about those people, Aristotle? They seem to really be enjoying their life, and they're getting it through very vicious means, and they seem to be quite happy with themselves here. What do we say about these individuals? What about that powerful tyrant who dies peacefully in their sleep after a very long reign? Isn't that a good life? Well, Aristotle and other virtue ethicists would argue that appearances here are deceiving. It might seem like they're having a really good life, but in fact they're not. Such people may indeed be pleased with how things are going, and they may even get a lot of enjoyment out of their lives, but virtue ethicists deny that pleasure is the end-all be-all. Pleasure without virtue is not much, he would say. Those individuals, they're always going to be worried about something like, say, the law. Maybe the law is going to catch up with them. They're going to be worried that someone else is trying to kill them or displace them or take their power or whatever it might be, that they're always looking over their shoulder. Where the virtuous man has a clear conscience, not only does he have a clear conscience, but he is an individual who doesn't have to constantly look over his shoulder to see if someone is coming to try to kill or take something from him as well. And so the virtuous person is truly the only one who can be happy, Aristotle is going to say here, because they've got good lives, even if they don't have the same pleasures and money and power and all that. So, how attractive is a life of virtue? Just think of what people want for their children, and this is one of my favorite pieces of this particular class. Think about those individuals who perhaps they do lead lives that are vicious, where they are getting things through evil means, and then ask them if they want their children to live the same kind of life that they do. And so I often work with individuals who are drug addicts and alcoholics, and what I found is that almost all of them, and I have yet to find one who didn't say this, so I mean, in my experience, all of them, but I doubt that's true. I would imagine that there's some that wouldn't say this. They don't want this life for their children. I'm an alcoholic. I'm a drug addict. I hope my children don't make the mistakes that I do. That's what we hear all the time. And so think about it for a moment. When it comes to a life of virtue versus a life of vice, you know, even those individuals who do get many, many things from the vicious actions that they take, from the vice-filled actions that they take, do you think they want the same thing for their children? Is that what we want? Is that really what most people are going to want and hope that their children will come to? Most people, on the other hand, what they hope for is that their children develop courage. They hope that their children become good friends, that they're sensitive to the discomforts of others, and that they will help people in need. That's what most people are going to hope for their children. And so that should be very powerful and something important that you should reflect on too. And that I've reflected on, but also that I've brought to the attention of other people. Think about what you're doing, and then think about if your child was doing what you were doing, would you want them to? Would you be okay with it? Would you be happy that they were doing what it is that you're doing? And if the answer is no, then maybe you should consider what you're doing, because if you don't want your children doing it, perhaps you shouldn't be doing it either. That should be something that we should really, really ponder and try to put back into our heads. If you don't want your kids doing it, there's probably something wrong in there, and you should probably not be doing it anyway. Virtuous people ordinarily do very well for themselves, even if the vicious sometimes have more fun, at least on the outside. Aristotle says, the virtuous are the ones who are truly living in happiness, flourishing. Not just that happiness that goes away, they're the ones that are flourishing. That is because human well-being is defined in terms of virtues. Virtues are those excellences of character that contribute to one's well-being. Without them, one is leading a life of an animal, or even worse. So Aristotle is going to say, the virtuous person is the only one who can truly be happy, who can truly thrive, and that if you don't have these things, basically you're living like, say, a pack of dogs or something like that, because those are the attributes that perhaps packs of dogs might have. Thinking of vicious packs of dogs, but in this case, the virtuous person has this kind of happiness, right? So virtue in this case, it's a skill. It's something that takes a long time to develop. It's going to be something that is a sign of maturity and experience. You have to have a degree of wisdom. All of those things are going to be really, really important so that you can then look at a given situation to try to figure out what the virtuous thing is to do. And that's also going to require that you can know and understand the emotions, what emotions should or shouldn't be involved in the decision-making process, or which ones are good in this decision, in this situation, as opposed to which ones are bad in this situation. All of these things we can, in trying to figure out all of these things, we can use two things. We can use some basic rules, but we can also use role models, virtuous persons who can show us the way as well. So we can use all of those things. It's very useful. Virtue ethics is very useful because it is going to counteract a lot of the weaknesses of other systems. It's going to give us things that other systems can't. And so from my perspective, if we take this kind of approach to morality as a skill, and it is something that takes practice, and it takes wisdom and maturity and all these things, if we can take that as kind of a framework, not the foundation, but more of the framework, and we use it, and we bring in all of the other moral theories because they're useful in the perspective that they provide, then if we have that kind of maturity and experience, and if we've developed our skills and all that, then we can use the other moral theories as tools where virtue ethics is going to be kind of the craftsman, and then say utilitarianism and feminism and deontology would be the tools in the hand of the craftsman who knows which tool to use and when. So right now I need a hammer, and so I need deontology, and you can pick up deontology, and now I need something not quite so severe as a hammer. Maybe I need more like a sander or something, so maybe pick up feminism and say, here's the time to apply this type of mentality as well. So you can almost see how virtue ethics might be, again, that master craftsman, and the rest of them are tools in the toolbox of the master craftsman. It's kind of the way I look at it, because it's the one who decides and understands through wisdom and experience when to take and use all of these other different ones. Now, having said that, because I think virtue ethics is very, very important. I think the wisdom and insight that it gives to us is highly important. That doesn't mean it doesn't have weaknesses. So here we're going to take a look at 4 weaknesses for virtue ethics. Okay, the first one, the relativity of virtue. An initial difficulty for virtue theory is that of identifying the virtues. If there is an objective list of virtues, as Aristotle and many virtue ethicists think there is, right? So if there is a list of objective virtues, then it's difficult to overcome cultural prejudice in saying what goes on in it. And what that means is that what is upheld as a virtue in one culture might not be seen as a virtue in another culture. How do you know which of these is the right virtue, right? How do you know which of these is a virtue? Aren't they perhaps then a vice? So for example, just try to help you see what's happening here. Compare the British and their taste for self-deprecation or for humility. They often are really, really humble. And isn't there a time that humility and being humble is a virtue? Yes, certainly that's the case. Hold that in opposition to the opposite side, which is the American style of confidence and self-belief. And Americans often display this. They believe, and often, that they can just do anything. They have this kind of overwhelming self-confidence and belief in their own abilities. And so what we see here is that, in a way, that confidence is also a virtue in believing that you can accomplish, because America and Americans have accomplished many, many great things simply kind of through believing in themselves, and we can do this. And so they go out and do it, right? It's pretty remarkable. So it's a virtue, but both of these are virtues, aren't they? And look at these two virtues. They conflict with each other. This idea of humility versus this idea of tremendous self-confidence. And so what will virtue ethics do with this particular situation? That's not to say that, because the virtue ethicist could look at this and say, well, here's when you apply one and here's when you apply the other. Certainly they can do that. How? Through, same old things, skill, time, practice, all that, right? That's not the issue. The issue here being that it's relative. These ideas, these two ideas, they're both they're both virtues. So which culture is applying a virtue correctly? And the answer is, well, both of them, really. They're doing it in two different ways. So what does a virtue ethicist do with this particular difficulty of, sometimes virtue is relative. It's relative to the culture. Obviously at this point, I don't think all things are relative. But in that case, I think this is an example of relativity of virtue. So how do you handle that as a virtue ethicist? All right, number 2, application. There is also the question of how to apply virtue theory to moral dilemmas. Virtue theory tells us to exhibit virtues, to act as the virtuous person would act. But, and this is the difficult part, right? If we don't already know how the virtuous person would act, then how do we know which person to follow? You have to know what's virtuous before you can follow a virtuous person. And if you already know what's virtuous, then you don't have to have the virtuous person in order to behave in a virtuous manner. So what do we do? What do we do with that? If we already know what to do, we don't need the example. But if we don't know what to do, how do we know we're following a virtuous person in the one that we are following? How do we know that they are in fact a virtuous person? So for example, a couple of issues that I think are particularly difficult, they're difficult to try and talk about, to know which side exactly has the virtue, is following the virtuous path. What about something like stem cell research? How would you identify a virtuous person on that topic and say, and therefore, I'm going to follow them and either, condone or condemn stem cell research? How do you know which person is virtuous? Or take, for example, the issue of animal rights. And you look at some of the individuals who are arguing on both sides of this particular issue. I think what you're going to find is virtuous individuals on both sides, because they're following perhaps conflicting virtues in that particular case. So how do you apply that? How do you figure out which person is virtuous and then accept their position or follow their lead? And it seems to be a very difficult thing that virtue ethicists are going to have to deal with, this particular idea of application. It's a tremendous theory, but moving the theory into reality can be difficult and tricky. It can be very helpful. On the other hand, I'm not sure that it just has all the answers of, and here's how you move it from theory to application. All right. The third weakness, when virtues are vices. Virtue theory appears to commend some behavior that we generally view as immoral. For instance, soldiers fighting unjust wars for oppressive regimes seem to exhibit courage. They are courageous, that's a virtue, but the regime that they're fighting for is not a virtuous regime. So are they morally virtuous? Are they behaving in a virtuous manner? Again, the Nazis are the easy example. Many of those soldiers displayed courage on the battlefield, and they weren't, committing some of the atrocities that the Nazi Party was committing. Are they virtuous? Are we to look at them and understand them as virtuous, or are we to look at them and understand them as filled with vice? Not sure how the virtuous person is going to handle that particular situation. So the battlefield is one example. Or for another example, imagine that you've got someone and you say of them, or imagine someone trying to say of this person, look at them, they're virtuous. Look at them at any other time of day. Don't look at them between 10 and 11, because at that time of day they're going to be robbing banks. But any other time you see this individual, they are virtuous. I mean, if they're bank robbers, but only between 10 and 11 a.m., but the rest of the time they're virtuous, are they truly virtuous? Well, then who could be considered a virtuous person? Do any of us at all times and in all moments display true and continuous virtue so that we would be called the virtuous ones? It seems that it's easy to climb to the top of a mountain, it's hard to climb to the top of a mountain. But in the case of climbing a mountain, you can sit on top of it. Once you're there, sitting on top of it is not a difficult thing to do. Virtue doesn't behave that way. In order to become a virtuous person, you have to climb to the top of the mountain, the virtue mountain, and that's a difficult thing to do. But it's also a difficult thing to stay at the top of the mountain once you reach the top. And so as you're trying to become virtuous, it's a struggle. But even as you try and you're trying to stay virtuous, and that's a struggle. And would someone have to be fully and completely virtuous in every way, or could we say that they're virtuous even when they screw up? But if they screw up, are they truly a person of virtue? And it seems to be a difficult thing for virtue ethicists to answer. Okay, the last weakness for virtue ethics. This one is called super-erogation. Super-erogation. It's spelled S-E-P-E-R, super, and then erogation, E-R-O-G-A-T-I-O-N, super-erogation. There. So there is also a difficulty in accounting for super-erogation, which is acting with exceptional goodness, right? To behave in a way that is super, it's above and beyond just the norm. So we have a Superman who is above and beyond just the normal human, and in this case, those who act above and beyond. Consider a rich Westerner who sells their possessions and relocates to a country in the developing world, giving the money that they save to the poor. We would normally think that someone who does this is to be applauded, even if we do not feel duty-bound to follow their example. Now, supererogation in this case, you've got a wealthy individual. They decide that this wealth isn't as important as other things. They move, they give it away. The rest of us aren't necessarily going to be held to that same standard. So that might be a virtue for them, but not necessarily. It doesn't have to be something that all of us have to do in order to be considered a virtuous person. It might be something that they do and it's super, but for the rest of us, it doesn't mean that we have to follow their example. On virtue theory, however, such acts as these are judged to be indicative of vice. And so sometimes we might see that as being a virtue. They gave away all their money. On the other hand, it really could be understood also as being a vice. For each virtue, remember, there are corresponding vices of excess and deficiency. If someone, in that case, gives away all of their money, we might see them as being virtuous and see them as being generous. On the other hand, isn't that really kind of an extreme? And this is one of the really good points of virtue ethics, is that virtue ethics tries to balance between things. So it's not going to allow that being fully and completely generous, just giving away everything, is necessarily the right thing to do. Because if you do that, then now the rest of us are going to have to take care of you, right? So you're not going to be able to take care of yourself anymore. So there has to be a balance between that type of generosity. Being overly generous is not a virtue, it's a vice. On the other hand, being too stingy is not a virtue, it's a vice. And again, this is where it takes that wise man through skill and practice and all those other things to figure out when is the right time to give and when the right time not to give. Haven't you ever seen that parent who loves their child, but they love them so much that they can't bring themselves to discipline the child, whatever form that discipline might be? They can't bring themselves to do it, and they need to move further away from love. Love has become a vice in this particular case, and they need to move further towards being that parent and being able to discipline, right? So with supererogation, being as generous as the rich Westerner, that's an extravagance that virtue ethicists are going to have a hard time dealing with. When is or where is the cutoff? We would look at that and we might say that that's a flaw, that's a vice in the rich Westerner's actions and activity. But where precisely is the boundary between that virtue and that vice? Too generous. How do we deal with those types of activities that might be that kind of supererogation? And is supererogation, is that kind of extreme always wrong, or are there times to do it? And the classic example is of Mother Teresa, who spent her life there in the gutters of Calcutta trying to help the poor and the sick. That's supererogatory. That's above and beyond the call of duty. The rest of us do not need to, don the robes of poverty and go pull to pull sick and dying people out of the gutters. That's not something that all of us are called to. What she did is super. It's above and beyond. How does that virtue ethics that says things need to be held in balance, how would they deal with somebody like a Mother Teresa? They're going to say that she went too far, to an excess. On the other hand, wasn't that really a tremendous thing? Wasn't the example perhaps that she gave to us one that we should uphold and say, no, in this case it was a virtue, and that she was behaving virtuously? And there doesn't seem to be necessarily room for that within virtue ethics, and so it's something that they're really going to struggle with. Well, in this case, perhaps like with Mother Teresa or the rich Westerner, maybe it was a virtue, maybe it wasn't a vice. How can you tell? What do you when do you know? And virtue ethicists are going to have to struggle to come up with an answer of when extreme generosity is a virtue and not a vice. Okay, so hopefully thinking through virtue ethics and thinking through the whole idea of it being a skill, and it's something that takes time to develop, and it's mature, and it takes you have to mature in your ability to use it. You have to be able to read people, understand situations, understand emotions, when they're a good thing, when they're a bad thing. It's all very, very complicated. Hopefully you can kind of see and understand why I was talking about the craftsman who takes the different tools of the moral theories and using the virtue ethics, using their ideas, can hopefully begin to take those things and tie them together, because morality is not something that's simple. Humanity is not simple, and situations here in our daily lives are not simple. And since they're not, it seems impossible that we would be able to just have a simplistic rule book that would simply say, and under these circumstances, and always do this. But it does seem, in fact, that what the virtue ethicists have to offer is saying it's complicated. It requires time, it requires practice, it requires skill, it requires the right kind of person with the right kind of training. All of these things are required, and then hopefully out of all of that, we will begin to have some understanding, and then even be able to start to apply within those situations that require moral decision making. We'll be able to apply those things and have some type of moral good outcome, and that moral good outcome will lead to us being virtuous persons. And as we are virtuous persons, then hopefully we will have lives that flourish, that are strengthened and made better because we are behaving morally, and we're able to also have other people in our society behave morally as well. Very complicated thing, morality. Hopefully you have through this course had some thoughts that have inspired you, or perhaps maybe made you reflect on yourself, or reflect on your community, reflect on your family, reflect on your past, your present, and your future. Hopefully something in here has helped you to try to move forward and to live what in philosophy we talk about so very often. Hopefully you'll have found something that will help you to have a good life. All right, and we will see you next time.